Fired Coaches podcast. Excited to have Jake von Scherrer on. Jake had me on his podcast not too long ago. I'm really excited to kind of get started with him. We both started our podcast at the same time. However, I feel like he's lapped me many times because he's been consistent since 2020, where I took a little bit of a break. He's the founder of the Educational AD podcast, which has a ton of interviews of ADs all across the country, high school level, and things like that. A great resource. He sent me his book, The Toolbox, which I'm kind of getting through right now, and I just find it fascinating how there's all these different athletic directors, and there's still nuggets you can find from a little bit of everybody because somebody has a different way of doing something, whether that's how they run events, how they document their process, just kind of take time for themselves. Jake's been a high school and college coach. He's coached football, track, spent time on the West Coast, kind of made it over to the East Coast, now down in Florida. He's been coach of the year, keynote speaker, written books, like I mentioned. Jake, just appreciate you taking some time to sit down on the Fired Coaches podcast.
Well, absolutely. And thanks for what you do. The Fired Coaches, it's a unique audience. Proud to be a member of that fraternity. But, again, sharing stories and as you mentioned, sharing nuggets. I think that's how we can help the profession that's, I think, been pretty good to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess, we'll talk about the podcast. We'll talk about obviously a lot of the things you got into, but, where did the coaching bug come from for you? At what point do you feel like it was kind of something that you wanted to get into and pursue?
Well, like many people, I was very blessed to just have some great teachers, some great coaches, growing up. My parents were not that big into sports, but they certainly allowed me to enjoy and take a deep dive into it. I think I remember, I might have been a freshman in high school, went to a big public high school, and just the group of young PE teachers who were also all coaches. I just remember thinking, hey, this would be a pretty good job, teaching PE and playing games all day. Really didn't think about it seriously until, maybe halfway through my collegiate career. Went to a small college in Oregon, played football and ran track. And I had taken like all the requirements, the sciences and the maths and everything. And my counselor said, you got to choose a major. And long story short, had an opportunity to do some youth coaching through our football team, our college football team. We coached the little guy football program a little bit in town. And, you can get paid to do this. And so that was kind of it. That I was reminded, you're going to have to be a teacher too. And I go, I guess I can teach. It's kind of like coaching. But it was really something I enjoyed doing, and it allowed me to not have to, what I called, work for a living. My dad was a contractor, and my brothers and I got to work for him. I say got. Summers and weekends growing up. And I just hated every minute of it, just hated it. And I remember him telling me once, it might have been that same year as a ninth grader, Jake, the secret to happiness is finding something that you love to do and then convincing somebody else to pay you to do that. And he had that as a contract. He just loved every aspect of it. I just hated it. But I found that in teaching and coaching. And so I thank him for giving me that lesson. I shared that with my kids. I shared it with a lot of my players too. So that's kind of how I got started on this career.
And when you were at Pacific, was that Division III or was that NAI?
We were NAI at the time. I was there 76 through 80. I like to say I got my high school and college education in that great decade of the 70s. But they are now Division III, and again, they've had some great success. And I still say with great pride, I am still on the top 10 all time for the 400 hurdles. I think I'm hanging on to maybe number 7 or number 8 right now. But yeah, great times at Pacific.
That's very cool. Talk about your early years in coaching. Obviously there was a heavy emphasis in what you did in college with kind of the football and track world. And, is there anything you remember from those early days? Again, the common theme seems to be in this podcast, which I think for a lot of athletes, where you go from being a competitive athlete, whether that's really good in high school or college, and you go into coaching. And I think there's a lot of thought of like, well, this is going to be easier than it actually is. So do you remember anything from those early days of things you look back on and you're like, man, I can't believe I did that? Or man, if I would have only known at that time, what I knew years later.
Gosh, constantly. And we hear that message over and over during my interviews, people that have the book. Boy, I wish this book was when I was a new AD. Like most young coaches, you think you know everything and you realize you know nothing. And what's worse is you don't know what you don't know. again, I was fortunate, had some great experienced coaches and administrators that I was able to work under and learn, sometimes hard lessons, but had a chance to learn them and begin consciously or unconsciously, putting tools into the toolbox. I think we were all coached, or I think we tend to coach the way that we were coached. And it wasn't like I had abusive coaches or anything, but they were loud and enthusiastic and, very much, I guess out of that Vince Lombardi mold. So, that's exactly how I started, my coaching career. And over the years, you begin to learn. My first job as a head football coach, I was a head football coach when I was 26 years old, had no business being a head high school football coach. But on my staff was a guy named Mike MacArthur. He was about my age, had played small college football in Oregon. His dad was Bill MacArthur, a legendary coach in the state of Oregon, almost 40 years coaching at the college level. He had retired a few years earlier, and here I've got Bill MacArthur on my staff. And, more than once, he'd pull me aside, Jake, you think you want to do that? Or have you thought about doing it this way? And it just saved me from, many, many more moments, but just how to work with kids, how to work with parents, any X and O, how to game plan. We, at Pacific, where I went to college, we threw the heck out of the football before it was fashionable, run and shoot. And so I kind of knew that, but offensive line play, what's that? Oh, you're line coach, you go coach that. Defense, famously or infamously, I remember telling my defensive coordinator, well, that's just defense. You worry about that. And just so many mistakes that, again, I was fortunate enough to have some guardrails on that kept me from completely going off the tracks.
And that was Sherman County, correct? When you were the head football coach for the first time?
Yes, sir.
I asked this, I can't remember what guest I asked a few weeks back, but being on the football side, I played high school football, love football, my favorite sport, but ended up playing basketball. As a head high school football coach, and again, obviously you've been a head coach at different spots, and I'm sure there's some where you've been a head coach in bigger towns and other ones where there's kind of smaller towns. If you're in like that smaller town, and again, you don't have a great, group of people, big pot to pick from in terms of coaches who want to help out. Is there a specific thought process you had as a football coach or as you've learned over time where it's like, to your point, right? Like, hey, I might know quarterbacks really well, but there's all these different positions, or, I might be a receivers guy. Is there a position you can put a guy in who's maybe really green, maybe had played in high school or is just really passionate about coaching kids, but just in terms of having the experience and things like that as green? Is there a position that you could put them at that it's like, hey, if they do this, I can give them the tools to get started, as opposed to we can't put them over there because there's just a laundry list of things to learn?
Well, to answer your question, yes, absolutely. And that, I guess, would be a lesson that I learned over time. So Sherman County, I want to say it was maybe 1983, 84. And again, I'm right out of college. Later on in my 40s and 50s, I was head coach and the athletic director at Coral Springs Christian down here in Florida. And it was kind of a startup program. But to answer your question, we had a gentleman on our staff. He was a teacher. He'd been a wrestler, but had never played football, high school or college. And he came out, I think it might have been week 2 of our two-a-days when we first got there. And he said, hey, I've been hearing great things from the kids. They love what you and we had basically me and 2 other guys, what you and the coaches are doing. I'd like to be a part of it. And in the discussion, I've never played football. So we ended up, we were, again, spread team, run and shoot. So our running backs, had a pretty simple playbook. And we met with them over the weekend, did a crash course. Here are your drills. Here's what they look like. Here's your script. Just follow it. And then we did the same thing on defense because we were coaching both sides of the ball. We had kind of an attacking, blitzing defense, so we put him in charge of the outside backers who were kind of stand-up defensive ends. Okay, here's the responsibility, here's the skills, here's what you do on the sled, just everything. And the kid, he was a young man, just a sponge. And nobody, knew that he was a novice. Everybody thought he was this great coach, and his enthusiasm and his desire to and willingness to learn and do things. And, we taught him how to watch film, and he just became an invaluable member of our staff while we were there at CSCA. So absolutely, you can do that.
I think you make a great point there too. And obviously, again, right, experience always helps. Again, you're going to obviously be a lot better coach, or should be a lot better coach in year 10 than you are in year 1. But in terms of like having documentation to be able to get a guy up to speed like that, is that something that you feel came more from when you took on AD roles and got down the road where, you're overseeing obviously, different coaches and managing a department and things like that, and just kind of understanding like, hey, we have to have processes in place? Or was that always how you've kind of been hardwired, ever since, you got in your early coaching days, where you always thought that, hey, to have processes and things in place is just important for the overall organization of things?
I don't want to say that I was completely unorganized during those early years. I don't think I could have gotten hired or had the degree of success that we were able to have. I was a climber. I wanted to be a head coach. And I'm going, well, geez, I'm a head coach at a small school. I want to be a head coach at a bigger school. So that early part of my career, I was really, in some ways, looking at that next job, which is not a healthy thing to do. But, we had some success, and I climbed that ladder. To answer your question, I think I really became a much better coach when I got hired at Missouri Valley College to be their offensive coordinator, and I was also the head track coach. But that group of coaches, from the head coach, the defense coordinator, the O-line coach, everybody on that staff, we are still, that was back in 1994, and we are still in touch today. We still say, I'm not going to say joke, we still say that was the best coaching staff in the history of the college. And, our players, who are now, probably in their 40s, will jokingly say the same thing at reunions. But that's where I think I really became a coach and could see I had the luxury of being able to see and examine and look at the other aspects of the game. Whereas before, okay, here's our offense. This is what we want to do. You coach the O-line. You coach the defense. And I wasn't the head coach that I should have been. I probably could have been had I taken more time to, learn about those other aspects of the game. But like I said, I had that opportunity when I went to Missouri Valley College.
Yeah. And how did that all come about? Because obviously you had been on the West Coast for a while, Washington and Oregon, being a coach, as you're talking about. And then in 94, you take that opportunity at Missouri Valley College. So what was kind of that leap of faith to get into the college level for the first time?
Well, I was coaching at the junior college in Oregon, Umpqua College in Roseburg, Oregon. I was there for 5 years. Was the head track coach and ended up starting the cross-country program there, or reviving it. I think they'd had the program since maybe the late 60s or something. So it's kind of a maybe 25-year dormancy. When I took over, there were like 34 schools in the Oregon-Washington Junior College Conference. We were, that previous year before I got there, they were second to last at the conference meet. So it was a worst situation, and I walked in knowing that. I was also coaching football on the side, local high school, helping out, and I was running kind of an all-star cultural exchange program. We can talk about that later. So I still had my hand in football. I was looking again to try to hook on at a 4-year school. That's where I thought I really wanted to coach. And I'll finally be, the happiest I can be. I was very happy at Umpqua. And again, at the end of 5 years, we were the number 2 team in Oregon. We were the number 3 team in that 30-plus conference.
Wow.
And got coach of the year. We worked hard. We recruited kids, a lot of local kids that, oh, geez, they have track out there. Got a couple kids, from California. Got 2 kids from the basketball team there that they were phenomenal athletes. So, again, we made it work. And to make a long story short, Missouri Valley, they were and they still are, they're a very, very successful NAIA program. I think they are still the winningest college football program in the history of college football by percentage.
Really?
Somebody might have snuck past them, but, they were perennial, top 20 team nationally. They were a running team and a lights out defensive team. They were looking for somebody to come in. They had just let their previous OC go, who knew the passing game. And that's all we did. We threw the heck out of the ball because that's all we had. We had all these little kids that were fast and short passes, so we had some statistical success. I also had my master's degree in health, and they were looking to start a health minor at their school. As they began talking to me, sifting through all the applications, and they told me this later, I was like the 4th guy that they ended up offering the job to. So other people had had their opportunity. As we were having those conversations, well, what does your wife do? Well, she's a teacher. She's a cross country and track coach. Geez, we're looking for a head cross country coach. Would she be interested? And so it was just these 3 or 4 things coming together at the right time. And those previous years, I had been sending out over 100 applications, offense coordinator, assistant football coach, head track coach to colleges all across the country, usually to the response of silence. And it never occurred to me that, well, they don't want a high school coach or a junior college coach. They're looking for somebody who's got 4-year experience. I learned that part of the game, after I got hired at a 4-year school. I thought, well, boy, this guy knows how to coach. He's had success at the high school level, the junior college level. Of course that would carry over to the 4-year. A lot of people don't think that way. So anyway, that's how we ended up at Missouri Valley, my wife and I, and we loved it there.
That's awesome. And I love that story of persistence because, again, as you can tell, right, like you're like years later, you're like, well, I was a high school guy and, maybe it wasn't a 4-year guy, but also it just goes to show you that sometimes when the parallels align and you're talking about the health minor that they're going to start and your wife being the cross country coach, like you never know, right? So sometimes it's just taking a lot of good cracks at the bat and, just seeing what you can do. When you were, I guess, stepping back here, when you were back in Oregon and talking about track, how big was the, Steve Prefontaine kind of, just the name? And obviously we hear that nowadays with University of Oregon and Phil Knight and Nike and all that stuff and the Prefontaine facilities and all that. But how big was that back in the day?
Well, Prefontaine ran in the, the Olympics in 1972, when I was a sophomore and that's, people have a hard time appreciating it now when you have 180 channels to choose from. Back then, there were 4, maybe 5 channels depending on where you live. And so you were watching the Olympics every year and, watching Steve Prefontaine compete in those Olympics. And then, as his career continued to flourish, in the Northwest, Oregon, Washington, you name it, Prefontaine's name was, very well known. It's I think with each succeeding year, despite, the Hollywood movies and the retelling of the stories, I think it's a little bit less. I think cross-country coaches do a good job of keeping it alive as a motivational thing for their kids. But, back in the day, even after he, tragically, passed in the car accident, Prefontaine, that's the gold standard. And still is, I think, in a lot of coaches' minds.
Yeah, absolutely. So, after you were in Missouri, you made that move to Norwich out in Vermont. Just talk about, again, kind of gradually, like, again, you moved from the West Coast, you're in Missouri for a little bit, and now you're out in Vermont, just kind of making that shift over a few years from West Coast to East Coast.
Well, again, at Missouri Valley, I can't say enough good things about the program, the coaches, and the experience. We go back just about every year because either a football player or one of our track kids is being inducted into their Hall of Fame. And my wife, Jan, and I were back there this last year as we got inducted into the Athletic Hall of Fame on the coattails of our phenomenal 1995 women's track team that 30 years later, individuals from that team still hold like 7 school records. Okay.
Wow.
That's how good those women were. So again, it was a great experience and we had great success, cross country were conference champs and same in track. Football went to the national playoffs. The head coach, who was the AD at the time, Greg Purdom, he's featured prominently in the foreword of the book that I sent you, Athletic Director's Toolbox, a mentor of mine, a friend of mine. We still talk frequently. I would say at least once a month, text or something. Long story short, and we tell this story too much, but I'm telling it now. He got in a pissing contest with our president at the time. He was upset about something. And to everyone's surprise, he lost that and was fired. And we all knew they're going to rehire him. They can't get rid of Greg. Well, they ran out and hired an alum real quickly. And again, I don't want to talk bad about everyone, but it took a couple of months for me to realize, okay, this isn't going to be a good fit. And our jobs, my wife's jobs, and our jobs were safe because we were faculty. Okay? We were teaching, full time, if college teaching can be called full-time, and then also, track and cross-country coach. So sent out some resumes, ended up getting hired at Norwich, knew nothing about it, ended up going up there. And I was expecting, okay, college, this is going to be just like Missouri Valley. Well, it wasn't. And again, not right, wrong, good or bad. It was different. And the head coach, very nice man. I remember I had moved up there early because we hadn't sold our house, and so we're in our early meetings, I think in August, and my family still hadn't gotten up there. And the head coach says, "Well, guys, I just met with the AD. If we don't win this year, we're all fired." I'm just going. I just moved my family up here.
So they're not even here yet, and I'm already being told maybe this is it.
So again, that was not a good sign. And I think we were 3-7 maybe that year. So the writing certainly was on the wall. Ended up going down to Florida, where Greg, my previous boss in Missouri Valley, had landed as a head football coach, and spent the fall there. They got a job for my wife teaching PE, and it's, hey, we're in Florida. It was pretty cool. And towards the end of the season, which was going well, we were doing well. He goes, "Hey, at the end of the year, I'm moving to Kansas. I got a job offer at this other school." And I said, "You're the only reason we came down here." So again, the job search, that's how I ended up out in California as the founding athletic director and head football coach at the Harker School. So again, sometimes you leave a place, it's your idea. Sometimes it's not your idea, but that explains a little bit of the coast to coast jumping around.
Yeah. Did you know? And again, I think this is interesting because in the moment, right, it's hard to understand, and maybe years later, looking back, it's easier. Between you and your wife, did you know that this would take you different places? Or did you kind of get a feeling that obviously when you're going from, like you were mentioning, being a community college coach in Oregon, and all of a sudden going to Missouri Valley, and it seemed like, again, with you going back there and having as much success as you did, like there was some synergy. And if Greg doesn't get fired there, you're there for maybe 30 years, right? Who knows what happens? But did you ever think that in your mind that would all happen, where all of a sudden you're shifting to all these different states in such a short amount of time?
We never thought about the shifting around. And you're absolutely right. Every year when we go back to Missouri Valley for those Hall of Fame ceremonies, as coaches, we all get together and we're going, if you could have kept your mouth shut, we'd all still be here. And he takes it because he kind of knows it's true. The moving, when I graduated from college, I wanted a job. I wanted to teach and coach. And this was in, Pacific is kind of in the Portland, Oregon, Willamette Valley area. And a bunch of my buddies were also graduating, and they were either getting jobs in the Portland area or they were reluctant to leave the Portland area. I wanted a job. And that's how I ended up in Eastern Oregon at Sherman County. My next job was back on the Oregon coast. The next job was down in Southern Oregon. So, hey, that's where the job is. So, the moving around, it just kind of became a byproduct. And it was kind of an adventure. Our kids got to see different parts of the country. That's a little bit how my life was growing up, because my dad's construction business, took him to different places around the Northwest. I think looking back, I think it was a benefit. Our kids learned how to make friends a lot and had some different experiences, have some, let's say, I don't want to say global, but have perspective on people in different parts of the country. But it wasn't any grand plan. Oh, we can see the country, as college coaches.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking back, I mean, that short stint that you had in Florida before you went out to California and were kind of finishing things, did that kind of give you some interest of like, hey, Florida might actually be a good spot to kind of sit down? Were you kind of wound back at the end of your career over there? Or was that just kind of by happenstance where, again, the job was the job and it was a good fit and that's just where it took you?
Really the second part. The job was the job. When we moved out to California, again, I told you I had kind of an all-star cultural exchange program where we would take high school seniors over to England during spring break, and we toured and we travel and we play British clubs or university teams in American football. And one of our coaches that we came across during that time was a guy named John Morrison. He was at Lake Forest Academy in Chicago area and ended up spending most of his latter career at Francis Parker out in San Diego, but he was always talking about these private school jobs, which I had no exposure to. I said, how do you hear about all these jobs? And he goes, oh, there's a company. It's kind of a headhunter company for private schools. And so I signed up, sent him my resume as a free service, and they gave me all these interviews. And one of them was at the Harker School in San Jose. They had been a K-8 school for I guess like 90 years, sending kids on to Stanford and other places. They wanted to start a high school. And so again, long story short, I was hired as their founding high school AD, was out there for about, a year. hiring coaches, getting the facility ready. I was, the head football coach. We won our opening game. We were just ninth graders. And so that's, great, great memories. Still in touch with many of those players. But and my wife was teaching and coaching there. Our kids went to school there. It was great. It was a great school. I think it was equal parts, my impatience with, trying to, put together a athletic program that I thought the school could be proud of, and working where there was, you hope there's at least equal support. I had good support, but I didn't have the same support as the fine arts, the dance, the music, etc. We literally, year 2, we're varsity. We've got sophomores. We had to cancel a game, not a practice. We had to cancel a basketball game because the performing arts department needed or wanted the gym with the stage for a rehearsal. Okay. And this is a game, it's a rehearsal. And so I began to look elsewhere. Also, and this wasn't the big reason, cost of living in San Jose, around 99, 2000 was just brutal. But again, look back at my time at Harker with much fondness.
And throughout your career, obviously, again, being the Fired Coaches podcast, you talked about Missouri Valley and Greg being fired and you being a part, like you're like, hey, I can stay here, but I don't know if this is going to work. Going to Norwich and just the different experiences where, you've either left somewhere because maybe, hey, budgets and, hey, we're going to have this rehearsal and it's going to cancel our game. And this is like, putting some pressure on me that I didn't expect I was going to have, or being let go. I mean, how have you kind of taken those in stride? And, anything, obviously, again, right, like leaving a place that you're building or being told like, hey, time is up is never fun. But there's anything that you kind of learn from or just going through those experiences that looking back that you're like, maybe that was a good thing, or this is what at least I learned from it. So if this happens again, I can at least, be better prepared for it.
Well, over the course of my 41 years as a teacher, coach, and athletic director, I got better at listening to parents, to even to students and coaches, to my bosses. I got better at, being patient, and whether that's not saying something or not doing something. I never hit anybody or anything like that, never cursed anybody out, but I just got better. And so I think my last stop in Tallahassee, I was definitely at my best. Had COVID not hit, and I didn't retire because of COVID, but I had it not hit, I think I might still be here or be there. And I wasn't fired. My wife was teaching public school. She was ready to retire. COVID was not as nice in the public school setting as we were able to manage at an independent school, because I had a great school. I had a great boss. I had great coaches. We had great kids. And for the most part, we had great parents. And so I really enjoyed that time of my life. And I think I was able to put together some of the skills, some of the tools that they had probably always been there in my career, but I finally became wise enough to use them while I was at Maclay. But I get a point that I thought you were maybe going to go down. I either loved being a coach and an AD so much, or the opposite. I just hated the idea of having to work for a living in a real job. That's why I stayed in coaching and education. I didn't want to work, and I loved what I was doing. Does that make sense? So if a job ended, hey, where's the next job? Who needs a coach? Who needs an AD?
Right. I guess, being an AD, and again, like, your toolbox book, which I'm going through, obviously your podcast, giving people a voice, putting that into a book format, just having all the information that's out there. And again, I like I said, I think it's interesting how, ADs can do things a lot of different ways. In terms of having thoughts and feelings about how this is how it should look. And maybe I have a coach background, maybe I'm an administrator, right? I mean, we can go on and we could do, 1,400 episodes ourselves and talking about different AD things. But, looking back, is there things that you miss a lot from being an AD? And then maybe some things where you're like, I really don't miss that part of the job too much.
Well, the relationships, with kids, with coaches, like I said, at Maclay, I had the best boss in the world. He was not a micromanager at all. He let all of his department heads, kind of run their program. He was interested in your program. He understood the value that athletics brings to the overall student experience. And, he said, that's our job. And talking to all the department heads, we need to enhance the student experience, enhance it in the classroom, on the fields, and drama and everything else. Just a great, great boss. So those relationships, miss game night, the game itself, but also, as you look out, and this is just, I'm trying to, I want to phrase this in the right way. Parents, they'll show up at a football game, basketball game, soccer game, and sometimes it's like they're amazed. Wow, the teams are here, and the officials, the announcer, the popcorn, and they're appreciative, but they have no idea the work that goes into making it appear like it did appear by magic. So, seeing their excitement, seeing the kids cheer, seeing a team that's they're having a rough season, but boy, they win that first game, and just they're celebrating like they just won the world championship, because in their mind they did. Those are the things I miss. I tried to, and again, in my later years, I did a much better job of this, tried to be a source of professional development and, tried to help coaches grow, whether you're a Hall of Fame coach or a brand new coach. How can I help you? Is there anything I can take off your plate to let you have more fun as a coach? Things like that. I certainly miss that, but I've also haven't stepped back into the ring, not so much this year, but the first few years I was retired. Hey, we're looking for a head football coach. Hey, we're looking for an athletic director. Would you be interested? And so it hasn't happened yet, but it might happen.
So there's still possibly that itch there maybe at some point if it's the right fit.
You never know.
That's awesome. I know as an athletic director, right? I think when I was on your podcast, you had mentioned, I don't know what we were talking about, but you had mentioned how you're like, hey, somebody didn't show up and it's the PA announcer for the baseball game, and I'm the guy in charge. I'm just going to jump up and do that. Is that something that you learned over time of like, hey, kind of having that flexibility where it's like, again, right? You could think of probably, again, 1,400 different things that could happen in an event of where you're like, well, I didn't have that one on my bingo card. But is there anything that, you over time that just became more natural through experiences? Or is that something where you feel like you either have that or you don't? Because if you're kind of open that way, you're going to be more prepared, as opposed to if you're just kind of, go by the moment, you might be a little bit frazzled by things.
Well, I'm sure that it's a skill like anything else that you can learn and get better at. For me, I was always kind of as a kid, I was a wise guy, class clown type of jock, I guess. Odd combination. But as a sophomore in high school, there was a JV football game. And I remember I just happened to be in the locker room towards the end of school. The AD was going, I think he was actually, cursing, the GD, announcer for the, freshman football game didn't show up. What am I going to do? And I looked at my best friend, Ray, who is still my best friend all these years later. And I said, hey, let's do that. That sounds like some fun. And so we went up to the AD and just said, hey, we'll be the announcers. And he looks at us, and he knew us, but he said, all right, kickoff's at 4:00, get out there. And, we knew where it was. There's no, here's how the microphone works or this or that. So, we go up there and we ended up, and again, this is 1971. So the original, Monday Night Football crew of, Howard Cosell and Don Meredith were, national names. And once or twice, maybe 10 or 11 times, Ray and I broke into a Howard and Dandy Don routine, and we could hear some chuckles, but we did that, I think, for 2 or 3 more games, and that really, if there was an announcing opportunity, not that there were many, but if there was one, hey, I'll do that. And so I was already comfortable with it, just because of my wise guy personality.
No doubt. Like I was mentioning at the start here, again, we both started podcasts in the summer of 2020. COVID, obviously, when pretty much every podcast I feel like in the world had started. You've done 1,400 episodes. The amount of, I've gone on your YouTube page, and obviously I've listened to some episodes like I told you about with Katie Pate and, different people that have been on there. And it's just amazing to see all the different guests from all the different locations you've had, in doing that and consistently doing that. And again, I know when we were talking on your podcast, you're like, well, I've had some time on my hands. I'm retired, but it's still to my point. I'm like, it's still work to sit down with people, give them a voice, to ask questions, to have the episodes go up and everything like that. So, when you started that, I'm assuming you probably didn't imagine where it would go. And like you said, I know if people are listening, you're going to continue to do it. But what have you learned, truly through that time? Again, I love the toolbox where you give people a chance to give 3 different thoughts of what could help a new athletic director or somebody who's earlier in their years. But what have you truly learned from producing all those episodes and meeting all those different guests?
Well, before I answer that, I want to give full credit to Don Baker and Josh Matthews. Now, they are 2 athletic directors in the state of Georgia, and I don't think they were the first athletic directors to start a podcast, but they were among the first. And they actually, this is during COVID, they reached out to me and asked if I wanted to come on their podcast. And I'm thinking, what's a podcast? I had no idea. And they host or had created, they called it Hangin', with an apostrophe, Hangin' with the AD. And they would have athletic directors on or coaches on, kind of talk about their lives, very similar to what my format is. And they were just so welcoming. It was kind of cool to talk about your school and your coaches and your athletes and yourself a little bit. And it was just so much fun and this was during, the spring of COVID. As things were working out, I was the president-elect for our state athletic director association. And I was looking for something I wanted to do. I wanted to have like a presidential project that nobody else had done. And I was thinking, hey, I could do a podcast for our Florida athletic directors, just like Don and Josh are doing. And I literally, like the next day, I got on my computer and started typing, how do you do a podcast? And that's where my podcast came from. And I've given them a credit just about every opportunity I can. I say you can either thank them or blame them for the fact that I have my podcast, and they've both been on mine more than once. They're great friends. They're great leaders, but I had so much fun on it. I'm thinking, well, everybody's going to want to do this. And I want to give them that experience to, brag about their school, to tell their story. You use the phrase, give them a voice. Everybody, has a story, and what makes one person's more worthy of sharing. And again, I've got the time to do it. I really enjoy doing it. And I think that we actually do, like you do, provide a service with our podcast by, letting people, share their story and some nuggets that they found successful in their career.
No, I agree. It's one of those things where a lot of people, right? Like, it's like, oh, the podcast space is flooded. There's so many out there, and it's true, right? But again, if you are focusing on an area, right, where like you're helping athletic directors all across the country. I mean, college athletic directors could listen to it, right? Take nuggets from it. I mean, just business leaders, but you're focused on ADs, just like I'm focused on fired coaches. And I think again, right, like everyone's got a story. That story could go to any podcast, but there's specifics within your story, right, that kind of fit where it's like, let's help those people that are in these areas or have gone through this, to give them something, right? And so, whether there's 150 people listening or 150,000, if you can help somebody out, I mean, if it's just one person a day, I think you're doing the work. So, Jake, I appreciate you jumping on, telling your story. I encourage people to go check out yours, the Educational AD podcast. A lot of great episodes on there. Jake's, I feel like he's got one up every single day, 7 days a week. It seems like one's popping up in my feed now that I've been following you and stuff like that. So again, appreciate you following, having me on and sitting down and having this conversation.
Oh, no, absolutely. And again, when I saw your podcast, I think it was on X, somebody maybe in my network had forwarded it. And I go, what is this? Fired coaches? And that's when I reached out. I just thought it was the coolest idea. And I think I shared this with you when you were on my podcast. Whether you're talking about coaches or ADs, there's 2 kinds: those that have been fired and those who are going to get fired. It's it's the nature of the beast. Thank goodness that I think people have an opportunity to come on yours and share that story. And whether it's, growth or commiseration or whatever, keep doing what you're doing.